This video goes over some common laboratory equipment and their uses for a chemistry classroom. Not all the equipment that you will be using during the year is listed on this, just the ones you're going to use over and over again. Anything that's not here, I'll explain the use for them when we use them. This is a beaker. A beaker is something that you're going to use in almost every lab that we do. Very useful for mixing, holding, pouring, and heating of chemicals. You'll notice that even though it does have numbers and lines on it, it doesn't have a lot of lines between the numbers. Those lines are called graduations. And since it doesn't have a lot of them, you don't want to use these to measure exact volumes because there's going to be a lot of guesswork involved. This is an Erlenmeyer flask. It's used for essentially the same thing that a beaker would be used for, mixing, pouring, holding, and heating of chemicals. But it's got a slightly different shape, so if you wanted to store chemicals for a little while, you could stopper the top. You never want to measure an exact volume of a liquid in an Erlenmeyer flask. Like a beaker, it doesn't have a lot of graduations between all the little lines. This is a graduated cylinder. A graduated cylinder has one function, and that is to measure exact volumes of liquids. So when you're trying to measure the volume of a liquid, you want to do it with a graduated cylinder. You'll notice it's got a lot of little lines between the numbers. You never want to use a graduated cylinder for heating or mixing or storing of chemicals. That's not its function. It could break. This is a test tube. A test tube is a small little tube with a round bottom that you can heat small amounts of chemicals and observe small, chemical reactions or chemicals in. You mix small amounts of chemicals in them. I don't know, test tubes, we don't use them too much, but when we do, you want to just be really careful. They have a round bottom, so you can't really set them on anything. This is a volumetric flask. Now, you're not going to use volumetric flasks too much. You might use them a little bit during the school year, but you'll see them lying around the lab. These are used for making solutions and storing solutions. You never want to heat one of these on a hot plate or over a Bunsen burner because the neck is so skinny, the liquid will just shoot right out of the top and probably splatter and hurt someone. This is a watch glass. A watch glass looks like a giant contact lens. It's made of glass and it's concave. And it's used for, observing small amounts of chemicals or chemical reactions, and you can also use it as a temporary cover for a beaker or a flask. You never want to throw these things around, though. You want to be very careful. They are made of glass and they can shatter, so don't use them as a frisbee. This is a glass stirring rod, and it's used for what it says it's used for. It's used for stirring chemicals. You'll notice that most of the lab equipment is made of glass. Glass is extremely unreactive with other chemicals, so it's a nice, material to make equipment out of. And the same is true here. They are very fragile, so you don't want to scrape anything with them, and definitely don't have any sword fights because they will shatter. This is a plastic pipette. Sometimes I refer to them as droppers. They're used for transferring liquids drop by drop. You don't really want to use them for measuring exact volumes because most of the time they don't have graduations on the side. And you definitely don't want to stir anything, especially something hot, because it'll melt it. Also, if you stir with them, you'll contaminate whatever's on the inside. This is a thermometer, and hopefully you know what thermometers are used for. This thermometer is it measures in degrees Celsius, and that's what all the thermometers in this class will measure in. You never want to stir with these, mostly just because they're really expensive, and if you broke them, we'd have to replace them. So they're not a stir rod, they're a thermometer, be careful, and don't have a sword fight. This is a metal spatula and a scupula. The metal spatula is on the left and the scupula is on the right, and they're essentially the same thing, they just look slightly different. They're used for scooping up small amounts of dry solid chemicals. You never want to use a scupula or a metal spatula to stir with, though, because metal can be pretty reactive with some other chemicals and it could mess up your experiment. This is a microplate or a microwell plate. It's basically a little plastic plate with a whole bunch of little wells in it, and they're used for small-scale experiments. So when you're using experiments, but you're doing it drop by drop. So you can do a whole bunch of them all in one little microwell plate and kind of look at them or compare them side by side. Never heat one of these things because they're plastic and they'll melt. This is a test tube clamp. Its uses are, well, holding test tubes, especially when they're hot because they'll burn your fingers, or when you're heating them over a Bunsen burner. You never want to use any of these or use one of these as like tongs because they're not very grippy. So you don't want to try to pick up or hold any other glassware with these things. Use tongs for that. This is an electronic scale. Every lab station has one. They're pretty expensive, so you want to be careful. Don't slam these things around or slam things onto them. You'll notice it has a plastic lid that's flipped up in this picture. Just make sure you flip up the plastic lid on yours before you put anything on it. Otherwise, the thing's not actually touching the scale and it won't give you a measurement. Just FYI. This is a hot plate. You're going to use hot plates a lot in this class. They're for heating of chemicals in beakers or flasks or anything, any glassware, anything made of glass with a flat bottom. You definitely don't want to be heating anything made of plastic on a hot plate because it will melt. And you don't want to put anything with a round bottom, like say a test tube on one of these, because it won't stay on there because it's got a round bottom. This is a Bunsen burner. Bunsen burners are used for heating chemicals just like a hot plate. The difference is this is an open flame as opposed to, like a stovetop hot plate. You never want to heat anything made of plastic, obviously, in a Bunsen burner because they'll melt. It's pretty easy to have accidents with a Bunsen burner because of that open flame, so you want to be very careful and turn them off when you're not using them.